Okay, Chag Sameach. We've made it to the 7th day of Pesach. Congratulations, guys. We have so far had 4 different services this year on Pesach. So you guys have been fully religioned, Pesach, matzad, thoroughly in and out. I hope it has been a liberating experience for you guys once again to be here on the Chag of Pesach. Chag Sameach. Alright, so today, of course, the reading we just read was the famous story of the splitting of the sea. What is the phrase we use? What do we call the splitting of the sea in Hebrew? Does anyone know how to pronounce that phrase? What is the Red Sea called in Hebrew? And the splitting of this Red Sea is? The Kiryat Yamsuf. Now it sounds familiar, right? You must have heard this by now. The Kiryat Yamsuf is how we refer to the splitting of the sea. But there's one little problem. The word Kiryat doesn't appear anywhere in the Torah in reference to the splitting of the sea. The Torah uses a different word to refer to the splitting of the sea. It uses the word boka'u. Not the springbokke, but some other boka'u. Boka'u. So you can maybe say the Kias Yamsuf is the splitting of the sea, but we still refer to it rather as the Kiryat Yamsuf. The word Kiryat, by the way, it sounds awesome, doesn't it? But the word Kiryat means tearing, to tear something. For example, if you go to a funeral, when someone loses a parent at the funeral, they actually tear their garments, the rending of the garments. We call that process the Kiryat. So Kiryat means the tearing of the sea, but the Torah calls it the Boka'u. So why do we have 2 names for the splitting of the sea? What if I suggest to you, I put it to you, remember that guy? The reason why we have 2 names for the splitting of the sea is because the sea split twice during the Exodus. Ever heard that before? Listen to this. Well, by the way, the whole Bible tells us that the water split 5 times in the Bible. At creation, Hashem split between the waters above and the waters below. Here in today's parashah, He split the sea for us. When we entered the land of Israel, He split the Jordan for us. When Elijah crossed the Jordan, He whacked it with his coat and it split. And when Elisha had to come back, return to sender, He split it again. So there are those 5. But during the Exodus, in this specific story we just read, it told us actually, if you look at the text, twice Hashem split the sea for the people of Israel, for the children of Israel. So let's look at this text. Read with me. All of you that have the Silver Siddur, you can turn to the text in page 1138. We just followed it there, 1138. If you don't have the Silver Siddur, you can just open a Bible there. If you've got a Bible that's got Hebrew as well. It's in Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. And we're going to look at some English and some Hebrew here to understand what's going on. Exodus 14 verse 21, in the Siddur it's page 1138. If you're looking at page 1138 in the Hebrew, it's 1139 I guess, Have a look at the Hebrew there about, actually let's start in English, page 1138 in the English. Alright, 2/3 of the way down, you'll see in the middle of the text there's a little hyphen. Find yourself there by the hyphen in the middle, 2/3 down. You see that? Just below that hyphen, a new sentence starts saying, Moses raised his hands. Okay, so that's Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. Follow along with me. On the left-hand side in the column, it's got the word night, and the new sentence begins, Moses raised his hand over the sea. And the Lord moved the sea with a strong easterly wind all night. It turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel walked into the midst of the sea on dry land. And the water was like a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, entering in after them, all the horses of Pharaoh, his chariots and horsemen, into the sea. And when the morning watch arrived, the Lord looked upon the Egyptian camp in a pillar of cloud and fire, and threw the Egyptian camp into confusion. The wheels of their chariots were unfastened and drove with difficulty. Let us escape from Israel, said the Egyptians, for the Lord is waging war for them against Egypt. The Lord said to Moses, raise your hand over the sea and the waters. Next page. And the waters will come down upon the Egyptians, their chariots and horsemen. Moses raised his hand over the sea, and as morning approached, the sea returned to its strength. All the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord shook the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned, covering their chariots and horsemen, along with all of Pharaoh's hosts who had entered the sea after them. Not one survived. So that's the story. God splits the sea. We walk in. It's a wall on our left and on our right. The Egyptians follow us. Hashem says, Moses, raise your hand. And he brings the sea back over them, and the sea is back like a normal sea. No longer split in half. What's the next verse say? The children of Israel walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the water was like a wall for them on their right and on their left. Didn't we already read that? Why is it repeated after the Egyptians were drowned and the sea returned to normal? Because the sea split twice. And there's differences between these two accounts. This whole section from verse 21 to 28 has a few differences than the section we read here in that very last verse there, verse 29. So let's look at these differences. First thing, in verse 22, the original crossing, it tells us that we went into the sea and the sea became dry land. It says, Hayam b'yabasha. So first we went into the water, and only once we were in the water that Hashem split the sea and became dry land for us. Verse 29, which we just read, opposite. It starts off by saying, B'yabasha betoch hayom. And there was dry land in the sea. So it splits there. So it shows us there's a difference between these two splittings. Another difference that it tells us, by the way, let me just mention while we're there, why does it say in the first one that we went into the sea and then it split? Because of the famous story, of Nachshon ben Aminadav, right? Remember, the prince of the tribe of Judah. No one wanted to go into the sea, so he took the leap of faith and he jumped into the sea by himself and started walking. And while he was walking, he was singing a song. What song was he singing? He was singing the Micha Mocha, and that's why we have the tradition that at each step he said a different word of the Micha Mocha. So it starts off with Mi Chamocha, you hear the Cha, but by the time the water got above his mouth, he couldn't pronounce the Ch sound anymore. That's why the second line of the Micha Mocha is Mi Kamocha. It's the harder sound, right? And then he went, ay, Micha Mocha. And then when he was under the water, the tradition tells us once he felt like he was drowning, he prayed to Hashem. Psalm 69, it says, "Save me, O Lord, for the waters are up to my neck." Psalm was written by David, one of his descendants. So either David got it from him, or he time traveled somehow and got the psalm and came back and prayed it. I'll leave that up to you guys. Go watch the movie Back to the Future. Nachshon had a flux capacitor, and that's how he did it. Okay, anyway, so that's the midrash about what happened. So that is why we first went into the sea, and then it became dry land, because we first walked in. There's other traditions as well that say all the tribes are actually arguing over who's going to go first, and Benjamin actually jumped in first. So there's different traditions as to how it happened, but we went into the sea, and then it became dry, whereas in the second time of the splitting the sea, it was already dry within the waters. Okay, another difference between these two versions of the crossing of the sea that we find in our text is that it tells us the first time we came into the sea, it says, Vayavo. What does the word bo mean? It means come. It says we came into the sea. All of us were standing there, and we saw it split, and it opened, and then we all came into the sea. Whereas in verse 29, with the second splitting, it says, Holachu. Lech, lecha, loch, halacha, walk. We went into the sea. We didn't come into the sea all together at the same time. This time, a few of them went into the sea because the sea had already been split by that point. So there's another difference between these two. And then a big one is, we have to look at the Hebrew word for the word wall. It says there was a wall on the left and a wall on their right. So the Hebrew word for wall is choma. Let's see if we can find it on page 1139, I guess, in the Hebrew side. If you have a look on the top of the page, before the song even begins, I think pretty much right in the middle, the very middle verse. So look on the left column in the middle verse. So there's 1, 2, 3, fourth verse from the top, fourth line from the top on the left. There's a word with 3 letters. You guys see it? It starts with a chet. In the middle is a mem. And on the left, a hey. That's the word chama. So that's the one in verse 29. Okay, that's the second splitting is spelled chama like that. Let's see how the wall chama was spelled earlier on the previous page, on page 1139. So page 1139, to find the word chama, we have to look down almost 2/3 down the page. Do you see on the left column there's 2 words that have semicolons above each other? See there on the left there's 2 semicolons above each other. The top semicolon, it's in that line. So you're going to jump from that semicolon 3 words in. You'll see another word there. It starts with a chet as well. But all of a sudden here we have a vav. And then a mem and a hey. Their chama is spelled with an extra letter. So our sages noticed here the word chama, wall, is spelled differently in both of these stories, in verse 29 and in the other story. So comes along the Mechilta, one of our oldest commentaries on the Torah, and tells us the word Chama without a Vav, in the second section, the second splitting of the sea, can mean the word rage or anger. Now Chama is also the word for heat, eh? So it's a type of anger or rage. The sea was angry. Why was the sea angry? Why were the waters angry? Because, who wants to do twice the amount of work, right? Why do I have to split again? I've already done this job. I've already, hurt my back doing the splitting in the first place. So one Midrash tells us that the sea actually agreed with Hashem at creation already. That in the future, on this very day, the 21st of Nisan, the 7th day of Pesach, it will split for the children of Israel. It agreed to that. But it did not agree to a second splitting. So the sea was angry that it had to split for a second time. And not part of the deal. That was not part of the deal. Yeah. It's not in the fine print, you see. I need extra compensation for the split. So, and by the way, there's actually an argument that the sea told Hashem, I need extra compensation. And Hashem said, don't worry, I'll give you even more chariots of the Egyptians later on. And there's a story of somewhere later in the Bible where the sea gets more chariots. But anyway, so the other interpretation of why it was angry was because of who the sea had to split for the second time. It had to split for a bunch of scoundrels who were working for Pharaoh that never came with us during the Exodus. Check this out. Go to page 1137 in your Siddur. If you've got a Bible, you can go to Exodus 14 verse 3. We're going to read the English here and then the Hebrew maybe. Exodus 14 verse 3. Let's see. It's in the section for Shalishi. So you can see in the column it says Levi, Shabbat, Shalishi. Right in the middle of the page. Alright, so it starts off by saying, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel. They must turn back and encamp near Pi Hachirot, between Migdol and the sea, before Baal Zephon. It is opposite this place that you shall encamp alongside the sea. And listen to this. Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are lost in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. Okay, so by this point, the Israelites have left Egypt. We're camping at all these strange places, and Pharaoh hears about the weird places we're camping, and Pharaoh says, of the children of Israel in the English, that they are lost in the land. What does it say in the Hebrew? Go into the Hebrew on the other side of the page. Also look there right in the middle of the page where it says in the brackets Shalishi. You can see the brackets there right in the middle of the page, the middle section. Next to the word Shalishi, you'll see the name Paro. There's Pharaoh's name. Jump one more word to the right so we can start the sentence at the beginning. It says, Vomar Paro Livnei Yisrael. Livnei, what does that mean? Bnei Israel is the children of Israel. If you put a lamed in front of a word, where's my Hebrew students? What does a lamed prefix mean? To. Spoke Pharaoh to the children of Israel, saying, wait a minute, weren't the children of Israel already out of Egypt? Camping in these weird places? So sages point out, Pharaoh was speaking here to some Jews who were still in Egypt, who didn't cross with the first crossing. And if it's Bnei Israel, how many Jews were there? Minimum? It's plural. So there were at least two. In fact, there were two. It was two Jews. Do you guys know of any two Jews who were bad boys working as informants for Pharaoh and the Egyptians? You know these two guys very well. Datan and Aviram. Remember those two troublemakers, Datan and Aviram. They were the ones, when Moses killed the Egyptian, they saw it. And then later on, the two of them were arguing with each other over who's going to have the last piece of chocolate matzah. And they were about to kill each other. And Moses intervened and they said, who are you to judge us? What? Are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian? And later on in the story of the Torah, we find out they're always the bad guys. They're always the ones that are responsible for doing all the bad things. They are the ones that, of course, moaned about the water, moaned about the food. They're the ones that went to go collect the manna on the Sabbath and it turned to worms. They're the ones who started the rebellion of Korach as well. The Talmud, not the Talmud, our sages tell us, it might be in the Talmud actually, that if you want to blame anything on somebody, blame it on them. No matter what. You've got freelance to just blame it on them. Because they are the root of all our problems, of Datan and Aviram. So Datan and Aviram, they stayed behind when we left Egypt. They accompanied Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh saw this and decided he's going to come up with his horses and chariots, Datan and Aviram came along to see the decimation of the rest of the Jews. And when the Egyptians drowned in that sea, what did Hashem do for Datan and Aviram? He gave them a VIP tunnel splitting off-ramp through the sea. They went into the sea with the Egyptians, and as the Egyptians drowned, the sea split again around the side so that Datan and Aviram could come across. This is why the sea was angry. And why am I supposed to split for these idolaters, these informants, these enemies of Moshe Rabbeinu, your chosen messenger? They don't deserve salvation, said the sea. And this is why when we read that section about the second splitting of the sea, it was opposite. Remember, there they first went into dry land within the sea, because the sea had already split the first time and allowed the Egyptians in. That's why they came in on dry land. That's why it says, holuchu, that they didn't come, but they went, because the sea was already ready and waiting for them. So here's a question, now that we know it's these two muchus that got the sea split for them. Why did they merit to have the sea split only for them? This is a weird question. The Midrash tells us, when Moshe had to choose the 70 elders over Israel, he chose from the 70 shoterim, the 70 officers, the police officers that we already had back in Egypt. Remember in Egypt, we had to go and work ourselves slavery all day long, but we also had taskmasters set above us, Jewish taskmasters, just like the capos, the Jewish taskmasters who had to make sure that we met the quota every day. All 70 of the elders that Moses chose to be the leaders of Israel were shoterim, including Datan and Aviram. And the Midrash tells us that once upon a time, when Moshe came to Pharaoh and said, hey, let my people go, we need to go worship for 3 days in the desert, Pharaoh said, 3 days, seems like you guys have a lot of time in your hands. Why not make your work even more then, seeing that you can handle more? I'm going to take away your straw. It wasn't just the restaurants nowadays that are like Pharaoh, taking away our straws, giving us that nonsense paper straws. It was even Pharaoh back then. He took away our straw. And what happened because he took away our straw? Our work was so much more difficult, and we couldn't meet our daily quotas of making those bricks to build the pyramids. That's why Sphinx doesn't have a nose. We didn't have time to make the nose. Okay? And what happened? At that moment, our officers stood up and they said to the Egyptian army, we will take the punishment for all of the slaves. And those 70 officers, including Datan and Aviram, got beaten and whipped on their back till the blood ran down their back. And they said, we will take the blame on ourselves, on behalf of Israel, our brethren. They sacrificed themselves for their brothers. And because of that, says the Midrash, these two guys, Datan and Aviram, no matter how bad they were, they still merited the salvation from Egypt. That is what it means to love your neighbor, to sacrifice yourself for your neighbor. Now, talking about sacrificing yourself, of course, it's Pesach time. And at Pesach time, we make a special emphasis on focusing on the work that Yeshua did for us on the cross. Because he laid down his life for all humanity on Pesach, bringing salvation to all four corners of the earth, to anyone who wants to grab onto the tzitzit of the Jew. And as his disciples, we should be imitators of our Messiah. Meaning that if he suffered for the sake of his brethren, for the sake of the whole world, we too shouldn't be surprised if we end up suffering for the sake of our brethren as well. This is what it means to be like your Messiah. I think Peter talks about counting it bitterness and considering it a bitter thing. This is what you were chosen for. And at the last meal that our Messiah had, at that Pesach Seder that he had with his disciples, he gave them a specific mitzvah. In addition to drinking of the blood and eating of the matzah in remembrance of him, he gave us a specific mitzvah, one that we should be reminded of every single Pesach. It says this, John 13 verse 34, a new commandment I give unto you, you shall love one another as I have loved you. How much did Yeshua love us? Until death. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. To the point of self-sacrifice, we also need to love our brothers. Now, Datan and Aviram, do you have to love them? Remember, Datan and Aviram, they still messed up later, hey? They did all those horrible things, the manna, Korach's rebellion, complaining about the water, all the stuff. We blame them for everything, right? They merited salvation from Egypt, but they still died in the desert. They didn't make it to the promised land. They hated Aaron, and they hated Moses. But they loved their own family, their own brothers. They were willing to sacrifice their life for their own brothers. So yes, sure, love for your brothers can merit having the sea split for you individually. But they still died out there in the desert. And Paul makes a point of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul talks about the fact that the Israelites were baptized into Moses, very much like we are baptized into the Messiah, yet their bodies were still strewn across the desert because of their idolatry and their sinful ways. Paul says, let this be a lesson for us. Let this be a warning to us. Don't say, I've been baptized. Once saved, always saved. They were baptized into Moses like we were baptized into Messiah, and they still died in the desert, not entering the promised land. This is why Yeshua teaches us as his disciples to not only love your brethren and your friends, the only people in these four walls, and hate everyone out there, because even the pagans do that. They chummy with each other. I rub your back, you rub my back. Yeshua tells us to love even our enemies. When the sea got angry and said to Hashem, I don't want to split for these guys, Hashem was teaching us, and even teaching the sea, the commandment to love your enemies. In fact, the Midrash tells us that when God was killing the Egyptians with the sea, all of the angels on high started singing the praises of Hashem. They were singing the full halal. And Hashem had to say to the angels, stop. You cannot sing as my creation gets destroyed. Yes, they might be the enemies of Israel. They might be the enemies of me. But they are still my creation. You cannot rejoice at the death of your enemy. And that is, by the way, why today, on the 7th and 8th day of Pesach, we only sing the half halal, not the full halal. This is the reason why. We are forbidden to rejoice in the death of our enemies. Now, fair enough, if God says go and kill your enemy, we're commanded to go and kill them. We still have to do that. We still have to fight that war. But we're forbidden to rejoice at the death of our enemies. Justice is justice, but don't be happy, and revenge is not ours, revenge is Hashem's. That's why we do the half halal today, on this day, Pesach day 7, when all of God's creation in Egypt was also destroyed. This is why at the Pesach Seder, when we did the 10 plagues, we used our pinky finger to take out 10 drops, one for each of the plague. Why? Because wine, yayin, is joy. Yayin equals joy in Judaism. We always say that. We had to decrease of our joy at the death of God's creation. Even the Egyptians, those wicked Egyptians, even though they died and after all they did for us, we still had to decrease our joy at their death. We cannot celebrate in their joy. And maybe this is why we refer to the splitting of the sea by the strange name Kiryat Yamsuf, tearing of the splitting of the sea. Because at the funeral, when someone dies, we do Kriya, the rending of the garments. Even God was saying, you must mourn for the death of your enemies. And in addition to that, that's what Pesach is about for us. Yeshua died for all mankind. Don't think that Datan Aviram out there isn't as good as you. He died for all mankind who come to accept it. So think about that. If loving your own brothers and friends and your inner circle can split the sea for you, imagine what loving your enemies can do. You won't even need the sea to split, because you will be able to walk on water. Chag Sameach.